Well, hello everyone. I'm Duncan. I'm here to talk about OpenC2, a new standard to try and let the defense take control back again. I'm going to have some giveaways, so if you stay till the end and ask some questions, I got a book by Alan Alda and a book on cybersecurity risks, the first couple people who ask questions. I like to get to know the audience a little bit. So how many of you are more blue team? This is a blue team track. How many of you are more red team, offensive track? How many of you are awake? No, that's good. All right. So there were a few people who didn't raise their hands, but they did on that one. So that was good. So this talk is a Prezi. If you haven't seen one of those before, and it's available online if you want to look at it. You can go to either. Let me go to the next one. You can either go on Peerlist, which is a security blogging site, and look up my handle, sfractal, or you can go on Twitter and look up my handle at the Sparrell and get the link to the copy of the slides if you want to run ahead of me and see what I'm going to say next or whatever. Or tomorrow you want to look at them or whatever it is that you'd want to do. Sort of standard disclaimers. I'm going to mention a bunch of company names throughout this. I have nothing to do with any of them. None of them are paying me to do it. In fact, probably some of them don't want me to say some of the things I'm going to say. So again, views are all my own. Talk some about some standards work that I'm involved in, but again, I'm speaking just for myself, not for that particular standards body. Keynote speaker this morning made some comments. A couple of other talks made this morning are that an awful lot of what goes on in security today is based on FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think that for us to move forward, we're going to have to move more into the economics of security, and I got a little bit on that before I get into the OpenC2, because I think if we really get into understanding risk and making it a more mathematical formula, it's going to be sort of a no-brainer to move to some of these new technologies, because FUD all said and done really isn't working. It's just water off a duck to most people, and for those of you who've seen the movie Jerry Maguire, it's really all about the money. So I want to get into a little bit of the economic aspects of what's going on there. But before I introduce OpenC2 and the standards on new command and control, and before I get into some of the economics of it, let me do a little bit of background to sort of get us all on the same baseline. So again, a lot of different numbers are flying around. I think we can all agree the cybersecurity industry has a fairly big market over the next 5 years. This has it being $1 trillion over the next 5 years. $1 trillion is a really, really big number. Okay, you could take 1/1000th of it and still have $1 billion. So big problem makes for big opportunity. I think some of the things we'll be talking about will actually be like the keynote speaker this morning. I'm actually optimistic. I think this number is overinflated, because I think we're going to do a better job, because there's that much money out there. We can start investing in the correct things, and some of it is the decision making to do those correct things. And we're also 1 million people short. A couple of talks today have talked about that. And again, that means we need to get into more automation, and actually that's what I'll be talking about today, some of the things that enable that. Automation and how they'll actually make things cheaper. In fact, my sort of buzzword is cheaper, better, faster. I think we really are capable of doing that. A book I highly recommend. I'm going to give it out. Again, I have nothing to do with either of these two authors. I just happen to like them as books. Actually don't even like this guy's writing style. However, I do like some of the contents of it that's very important. I'm going to go over a little bit of that, share with you. So I think if we start making more intelligent decisions on how we spend the money, not using the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, not using the scare tactics, actually using a business case analysis of this thing is better than that thing, we'll start driving behavior in the correct direction. So a quote out of the book that basically says, we're not as special as we think we are. We think that cybersecurity is way, way different than everything else, because it's all this, minimum data. We don't know what's going on. It's very chaotic. Things change day to day. It turns out there's lots of other fields that have had to deal with this in the past. They've put in some actual mathematical modeling to do all this, and that some of those models will apply. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details of the book. I'm just going to steal a couple things from it. You can read the book yourself and do it. But I agree with the author in this case that we aren't as special as we think we are, and there's a couple of particular things that he harps on. So the NIST cybersecurity risk model has some particular scales, the heat maps, and they're all certainly better than not doing anything, but he has some proposals on how you can actually turn it all into money, and that's a much better metric by which to measure things. Got a lot of different stuff in the book, but a particular one I'm going to harp on, or expand on a little bit, I guess would be a better way to say it, is something called the loss exceedance curve. So this is sort of the equivalent to the heat map in the NIST standard. It's even a little bit similar in that you want to stay away from the upper right. You want to be down in the lower left if you can. But the way this particular curve works is across the bottom is a dollar scale. This particular one's in millions of dollars, and it happens to be a logarithmic scale. And on the x-axis or on the y-axis is the probability. How likely is this to happen? So if you take a particular point as an example, you can say that your prediction is there's a 70% chance that you'll have a loss greater than $1 million, and again, something that's fixed across this whole chart is a period of time. So this might say be a 3-year chart. So it says, hey, about a 70% chance the company's going to lose $1 million due to something to do with cybersecurity in the next 3 years. There's about a 40% chance we're going to hit with something that's going to cost us $10 million. And there's about a 15% chance it's going to cost us $100 million. It's obviously going to be a big enough company to have that number. And whether you think this is like a bad chart or a good chart depends a lot on your company. Okay. There are many banks that would love to have this good security. Okay. And there's a lot of probably smaller companies that would, the lower part of this curve would be an extinction event. So it really depends on what you're doing. But the point of the matter is you can make a prediction. You can put it into quantifiable things that math actually works on. You can decompose the problem and build it up in a lot of details that I'm not going to get into in the book. But I find that what it's really useful for is comparing alternatives. So if you have a blue case and a red case, and they end up with two different charts. Well, which of the charts is better? In this particular case, the red chart is better. So sort of at the low end of the curve, there's a 30% chance on the red chart that it's not going to cost you anything in the next 3 years, where it's only 15% in the blue chart, etc. The sort of 50-50 case, the sort of median case, you're going to look at is you're going to lose only less than $1 million instead of $5 million. So again, this might be a case of a bank that's losing, $10 million a year, and it's trying to reduce the number by putting some technology in. And then down at the more at the extinction level events, there's you drop the chance of it happening from a 10% case to a 1% case. So when you make curves like this on the two alternatives, it makes it fairly obvious how to compare the alternatives. If the red and blue cases both cost the same amount, well, it's a no-brainer. You pick the red one. Okay. If the red one costs more than the blue one, then you have to plug that back into the rest of your business processes and say, is it worth however much it would cost to do this to reduce this by this much? But it allows you to make intelligent decisions, and this is the kind of math that boards understand because they do this kind of stuff in financial extrapolation in what they're doing anyway. And the best case, the red curve costs less than the blue curve, then it's a truly no-brainer. It really is the cheaper, better, faster example. And I think some of the automation technologies I'll be talking about later in the talk, as if you really do all this math, you really will end up with that red chart that it's both cheaper and better, and both of those are because it's faster. That's really the main thing that's going to buy you. So again, fundamental message, use real math in what you're doing here, and there's ways to do it, and I can't teach it to you in a couple minutes, but there is known lore on how to do that. So now what's the fundamental problem that OpenC2 is trying to solve? This particular chart is from the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report of a couple years ago. I particularly like it because of the particular way they presented the data. The data is not too different in either of the two reports beyond this. It looks a little bit better in some cases, a little bit worse actually in some cases too. But fundamentally the data is about the same, but it displays it best in this particular chart, which they didn't reuse in the other reports. But what the top row basically says is the attackers get in very quickly. Okay, so 43% of the time they're in seconds. Way down at the other end of the curve, it sometimes takes them months to get in, but that's only in 7% of the cases that occurred in that particular year that they did all the investigations of. The reason they can do all that is software vulnerabilities. It's a whole different talk. That's not what I'll be talking about. The particular technologies I'll be talking about, unfortunately, won't help keep them out. Okay, technologies I'm going to be talking about, or the standards I'm going to be talking about, are more on the second row, which is what it's saying is we are very, very slow at finding them and kicking them out. So whereas they're getting in seconds, we're not finding them for days, weeks, or sometimes even months or years. And in some of the newer data, it's sort of interesting. We are getting a little bit faster. Some of the data on the bottom row is moving a little bit more to the left. However, the numbers at the right-hand side are actually getting larger. Oops, I guess I can't not touch anything for a while. And that's not because the attackers necessarily got better. It's actually because defense got a little bit better and found them, but they found them and they'd been in there for 4 years, which tends to distort the data over there when you find them. So that's what I'll be talking about, is trying to get that lower stuff on the lower curve more to the left. So how do we solve this? A bunch of people got together from industry and from the government, created this fancy buzzword IACD, which is Integrative Active Cyber Defense, which what they're trying to do, their sort of buzzword of doing this, is get there so it's not people in the loop to people on the loop. In other words, you want to remove the humans from that lower case. And two other objectives of this is product agnostic interoperability. It's particularly one of the reasons I got involved in the standards effort. I worked for AT&T for a large number of years. I was their chief security architect, and it really got me upset that every time we switched vendors, we had to redesign all our software because they didn't even use the same word for what you wanted to do when you wanted to, block an IP. This one used deny and that one used block. I mean, forget semantics and syntax. They didn't even have the same vocabulary. And then the way that the IACD crowd does this is by decoupling the functions and then standardizing the interfaces on the functions, which is really, really important as we move more and more to cloud. Because, back when I was buying tens of millions of dollars a year for AT&T, I was buying actual boxes and you had to install them and they were in there for years. Now it's, a few clicks on the buttons and you can switch between cloud security appliance vendors very quickly if it wasn't for the fact they didn't speak the same language, which is why we got to get standardization in these interfaces. Because what vendors want to do is lock you into them. And if you have done a lot of purchasing, you'll discover they have all sorts of hidden tricks that sort of once they get their foot in the door, you keep buying the same thing from them because it's just easier than switching to someone else. And basically this effort's trying to reverse that. It's trying to make it be so you really can switch easily. And the particular standardizing the interfaces to the functions they're trying to standardize, this particular crowd came up with 4 sort of basic things to lump the functions into. Sensing is the security gear that creates indicators, that says, hey, something's going on, and it's creating the data. Sense making is just like it sounds. You're making sense of the data created by the sense maker. So this is usually data enhancement. Things like, not only did I get an IP on this particular port, it's, this particular IP is from someone I already have on a bad guy list, or this particular port shouldn't be coming in here, or this box has nothing to do with that port. Why is it doing? So sense making is putting that extra data around it. Decision making is saying, yeah, that was a bad IP on something it wasn't supposed to be doing. I probably shouldn't allow that. I probably should block it. Okay, so decision making is the decision to, hey, let's go tell the system, don't let it do that anymore. Or a particular piece of malware did get into my system. Okay, what do I want to do about it? I got to get it over to a sandbox and I want to detonate it and I want to find everywhere else that went on. I want to put more resources against whatever it is I found. So it's not only at the keeping them out sense, it's also at the reacting to whatever you're finding sense. And again, this is very important in a cloud environment because now you have the ability for both flexibility and fungibility of your resources so that when you see an event like that, you can scale up the resources and get them dealing with it if you had some common command and control language to do that, which is again why we're working in that particular area. And then, I should have said enacting. The fourth area is, okay, I've decided I want to block it. I got to go tell my network to do that. I got to go tell stuff to do that. I found this bad piece of malware. I got to go delete it. I got to go move stuff around, do whatever I need to do. So a little bit more on the getting the humans out of the loop. One of the reasons for that Verizon chart that had some things taking so long is because at times, in fact, most cases today, humans are involved in the process of what you do in an incident. The whole incident response team, almost always, the human is actually in the loop. You don't sort of let the computers do the things for themselves, and we're trying to change that with some of the stuff that we're doing. So from being in the loop to on the loop, you want to have thought ahead of time of what might have happened, designed what are called playbooks, designed scenarios for the cases to how to handle that, okay, and then do it. And I was at RSA earlier this year, and I heard forget who said it. I should write it down so I could attribute it to them. But I heard an absolutely great quote, so I had to make a chart of it. And that's that the attackers are working at the speed of light, and the defenders are working at the speed of lawyers. Okay, and that accounts for a lot of that. So in the case of things like, technology can't solve all problems. There are going to be process issues, and so you do have to work out what attacks do you think you might have to deal with in the future. Go talk to your legal team now. Work out how you want to deal with it now before it occurs. Because if you're doing it while the attack's going on, you've already lost. It's way too late. If you've ever dealt with lawyers, you know that you don't turn things around very quickly. So you want to work that all out ahead of time. But given you can get the process stuff out of the way, let's get to some of the technology that will help. So they have these 4 different areas. Particular area that about 5 years or so ago, some efforts got involved in. I was involved with them making this thing called Sticks and Taxi, which are basically ways to exchange threat intelligence usually between organizations. So if my company, when I worked for AT&T, came up with some stuff, hey, we want to tell Verizon, hey, we saw this kind of attack, they saw that kind of attack, or we had a bunch of banks as customers, a given bank saw an attack, we should be looking for that against the other against the other banks. That went okay, but it's had an awful lot of process issues. It has an awful lot of that at the speed of lawyers issues. And it also has a problem because there's not really that much of an economic driver for it. Okay. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is, once you've been hacked, you've sort of already lost your whatever you're going to lose. And by sharing that with your community, they're going to gain. Well, that's not generally the best competitive thing to do, is you lose money and help your competitors not lose the same amount of money. So that's one particular problem. But the other problem is, of course, the whole legal aspects on sharing data and everything else. And then the probably more major problem is, once you get all that data, well, they already had a lot of data, and then you throw some more data on top of it. They weren't handling the data that they already had. Any given company was basically is already receiving more data than they can handle, and it's all a prioritization issue. And yeah, maybe if you could share information, it would help you a little bit in prioritizing what's most important, and you might catch something you hadn't caught. But if you're basically, drowning already, throwing more water on the situation doesn't help. However, hopefully, the stuff I'll be talking about will help a lot in that area as well. And in the acting area, because again, there are no current standards, almost all gear has its own proprietary interface that you talk over. Many of them nowadays are smart. They have APIs, which are good, but none of them at all look the same, which means you get sort of embedded in one particular way of doing things, and you can't easily switch, and you can't add new stuff quickly, which again, as everybody knows in the security world, speed is of the essence in these things. So, where are we at today, and what are we going to do about it? Well, today's systems, or yesterday's systems, depending on sort of whether you've started implementing all this stuff or not, are mostly static. When we first started installing all the security gear, I'm actually old enough to predate cybersecurity as an industry. We basically bought gear, and you bought gear at purchasing speeds. That's speeds of months. That's very slow. So you could sort of configure them at best case human day kind of speeds. And unfortunately, that mentality has carried through, and people are now catching on a little bit and making more real-time APIs, but that's where we need to get to. But probably the bigger problem is basically it's a very immature industry. We're very new at all of this, okay? And so everybody does things their own way, which means a bunch of proprietary interfaces that don't interoperate. And if you're trying to build an ecosystem that can respond in real time to attacks, I don't care how good the vendor is, there's no vendor that can sort of cover the whole security waterfront. So you're going to need to plug these parts together, and we need a better way to do that, and that's basically what we're working on. So we formed this organization, formed this standard, OpenC2. Government's pretty heavily involved in it, so it's got sort of that military speak to it. That's why it's called C2, from the old C cubed I. The C2 of the 2 C's of the 3 C's in the I, and C cubed I is command and control. So OpenC2 is We need a common command and control language to talk to any security, anything, to be able to do any function that you need to do. And then you don't need to, retrain when you switch from vendor 1 to vendor 2. If you want to use a very different type of technology, but it's got the same functionality in it, you want to block an IP. I don't care whether it's a router that's doing it, a next generation firewall that's doing it, an IDS that's doing it. Those are very different technologies, but block an IP is block an IP. It just should be one way to do it. So got a bunch of people involved. The government sort of kicked it off. Got a bunch of commercial users involved, but also got a bunch of vendors involved. And the vendors sort of fall into two camps, which are the orchestration vendors, the ones sort of in that upper part of the tier that I said before, the ones that are doing those decision-making functions, the ones that are deciding what is the act you have to do, where you put those playbooks in, and the security technology itself, the gear that's being talked to. And the language is flexible enough and can be used not just for orchestrator to, we call them actuators, to the security technology that's doing whatever acting you need done. It can also be between orchestration devices. So you can even do cross-company or cross-business unit or even, government to industry kind of general high-level instructions, and then the individual companies figure out that means, oh, go tell this firewall that, and go tell this, end user that, whatever. So on the purchasing side of the house, the companies involved that have been highly active to date in the community, the actual organization is chaired by the Bank of America and the National Security Agency. Department of Homeland Security is involved. The NSA people involved are actually the ones speaking for the procurement arm of the Department of Defense. It's a pretty large market, so you sort of get vendors' attention that way. AT&T is involved. You may not have heard of Zepco, but I'm going to shout out to them a couple times throughout this. They're a managed security provider in the United Kingdom, and they've done a lot of work. They put some good open source in this area out on the web, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And sort of everything I said just up until this point is more, I'm going to say, IT-oriented, more sort of classic computer security-oriented. But there's also a very large interest in this from the OT side of the house, from the operational technology. So the California Energy System for the 21st Century, something called CES-21, needs to be able to respond to attacks against the energy systems, sort of the cyber-physical world. I like to say where bits and bytes meets flesh and blood. So they have safety concerns that they're caring about. They're trying to get more to what they call to the left of boom. You want to get there before you explode the thing. And that chart that I showed earlier that had basically dollars across the bottom in the safety world, which is where a lot of those kind of charts actually came from. Instead of putting dollars at the bottom, they put lives at the bottom. They actually worry about how many people die, and if you put this in, less people will die. Same chart, same math, everything works the same way. And so they're also very interested in this standardization. And sort of all this crowd is all more on the purchasing side of the house. Obviously, you get a bunch of big purchasers on the side of the house. You get a lot of attention from the vendor side of the house too. So a couple of other management positions in the organization are filled. One's filled by Cisco Systems, so a big network side of the house. Another's filled by Symantec, so again, big end user side of the house. We think we sort of got all bases covered. There's a bunch of other companies involved that I've thrown up there that have adopted and are using OpenC2. I probably should have mentioned on the previous slide. Let me go back to it for one sec. One of the things I meant to say about Zepco is besides providing this open source code, which I'll go over in a few minutes, they've actually been using OpenC2 now in production for about 6 months. So they've been able to provide us with a lot of very useful data, a lot of very useful feedback on the, hey, you guys screwed up. It really should be this way instead of that way. We make some changes based on their output. And the reason they've been able to do that, because again, the vendors haven't, we're just coming up with this stuff. The vendors haven't switched over to it yet, is they've written a lot of, people argue on the word, whether it's a proxy or whether it's a translator or whether it's a shim, but they've written a lot of code so you can talk with standard, a lot of big name standard security devices and translate them from OpenC2 to their proprietary interfaces. And they've actually open sourced that code and shared it. But the point of the matter is the stuff is in production. It is working. And there's a couple other instances of that as well. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of the language itself. You can go look in a bunch of places. I'll show you some of the places to look. But openc2.org is a website that has some data about this whole effort in it. There is a GitHub site, and again, it's OpenC2-org is the name of its whatever you call a group of repositories. I'm drawing a blank on the name. And I'll go over a couple of them. In fact, why don't I just switch to them for a second? And then the third thing you can go to is OASIS. OASIS is the standards group that's working on this. So you can go to the OASIS website. And again, like most standards website, you're going to get into a lot of procedural detail of, how we're organized and who's doing what and when our next meeting is. And yes, you can find the documents, but it's still a little, but we got to work better at that part of the job. But you can go to OASIS to find stuff. I mentioned the OpenC2.org. That's the website there. Again, it needs a little refreshing because some of the things that it has upcoming just occurred, but they're not too far out of date. And that's got some tutorial stuff, some links to some documentation, and again, link to some prototypes, basically some open source that you can find on some of this stuff, which basically links you over to the GitHub project. That was the name I couldn't think of before, which has a bunch of repositories under it. The main one you'd probably want to go to, again, we're not very original in our names, so the sort of project name is OpenC2-org, and the main repository is OpenC2-org. We probably should have named it something different than that, like main or something, I don't know. But you'll notice there's a meetings subdirectory. You can go find all the information. There's a lot of documentation, and there's a lot of, you can look at, hey, fortunately, the meeting minutes aren't that detailed to show us how we, 4 months, or actually it's about a year ago now, argued literally for 3 hours on the meaning of the word stop. I mean, we had a lot of, you don't want to go to the sausage factory unless you do. We would actually welcome much more participation. But what's also, I think, probably more important on this site is there's a bunch of prototype implementations or reference implementations, depending on how you want to talk about them. One is, it is a language. It is a JSON-based way of talking. And since it's a JSON-based way of talking, somebody went and designed this thing called Jane, which is basically a JSON encoding language for encoding languages that are specified in JSON. So it's sort of I like recursive kind of things, but it stands for JSON Abstract Encoding Notation. And so it's a way to specify this language in a way that's much more testable than our standard sort of a bunch of documents. Oops. I spent too long doing this. And then I mentioned the Zepco guys. They have this part of the website called OrcID, and this is where the proxies are that basically you can convert from standard OpenC2 language to a bunch of different, I don't know, I could get in here and find a bunch of them, but there's, Palo Alto and, all the big manufacturers, particularly of firewalls and SIMs and IDSs and stuff like that. They've done a lot of work, really a lot of work in this area of basically making a common orchestrator. So shout out to them. And those are, I think, written in Python, if I remember correctly. And the Jane stuff might be I think it's mostly in Python also. And then a grad student did some work in, again, making some Python end components that would be controlled by an orchestrator that happened to be called Yuki. And I personally don't trust any interface that's only ever been sort of used by one person or only ever written. There's only one set of code for it, particularly only in one language. So to try and get things in a more multi-language thing, although I am a big fan of Python, my favorite language is actually Erlang. Any Erlang programmers in the room? Yeah, I didn't think so. But anyway, it's a very good language for security. It's built for very, very high reliability. So it's designed to work when the hardware breaks, and it's designed to work when the software breaks, which, by the way, is a great thing for security code. So I actually wrote a simulator of OpenC2 in Erlang, and that's available at OCAS. You could look at it as the plural of OCA, which is a South American tuber, because I don't like acronyms, or you could concede that it means Open C2 API Simulator. But that's there as well. So we do have multiple languages. Different people have implemented it, and they talk to each other. And in doing that, we did uncover a lot of problems. We did uncover that, hey, I coded it this way. And I said, well, I coded it this way. Well, they don't work. Ooh, then we didn't define the spec right. We need to put something in there. Didn't matter which one's right. I don't care if it's red or blue. We gotta specify the colors so that they'll talk to each other. The language itself, a lot of argument went on to try and make the language as flexible as possible, because all said and done, we know the industry is changing a lot. We can design it for every piece of security gear that we know of today and know that there'll be security gear tomorrow that we didn't think of. There's just like the threats constantly involved, the defenses against the threats constantly involved, and there'll probably be some things we need to do that we haven't thought of yet. So we don't want to rewrite the code every time we do anything. So we tried to make the language modular enough to keep the code, the different pieces of the code separate enough so that we could add to it easily. And I think in some of both the Python work that was done, particularly with the Jane stuff, and the work that I did in Erlang, we both sort of went about it in a way to realize it was going to change. And since all said and done, we didn't know what we were doing. It took us a while to get it all right. There were changes that went on. I think we have proved that the language is resilient to both changes and new features being added. So it's got 4 components that are actually easiest to explain by example. So it is in JSON format. The red is what it is you're trying to do. Okay, it's the action. The action is what you're trying to do. And the target is is the subject of the action. Okay, in this particular case, it's an IP connection that you want to deny access to. The actuator in OpenC2 speak, we had a lot of argument, but we ended up with the security technology thing that you're talking about is the thing that's doing the acting. So the word that we ended up using was the actuator. So you want to talk to the actuator. You can actually leave the actuator out of the equation because it could be something like you're putting this as part of a sticks and taxi course of action, and one company is telling another company, hey, when you get this kind of attack, here's what you want to do to mitigate it. I don't know what firewalls you have and IDSs you have and where your detonation sandbox is. I just know that you have one, so I could still send the generic command and let you figure out where you want to implement it in the details. But again, the actuator is the thing that does it. In this particular case, it's some firewall off in New Jersey. And then, like everything else, there's, that stuff we don't know where to fit it, so we fit it in modifiers. And that's things like, hey, I want to put an ID in the command so that when the answer comes back, I'll know which one I was talking about and stuff like that. And then I want a particular kind of answer back. Again, a lot of gory detail in the spec. You can go read it yourself if you want to implement it, or if you just want to know more about it. So this particular slide is a slide taken that was presented by Symantec in a talk they did, again, just to give another example and to sort of, shout out to other people who are doing work in this area. In this particular case, you got some orchestrator that wants to tell some end devices, hey, get rid of this bad file. It happens to be a delete command, and there's the details of it. Those are pretty, block an IP, delete a file. Those are pretty simple cases. In real life, you're making playbooks that are a lot more complicated. You want to respond in real time to something that comes in the future that you don't know yet what it's going to be. You're going to have to put decision points in. You're going to have to put a lot like a military report or military playbook. You're going to have to account for, hey, if this happens to this, if that happens to this, so when you get this, go over here and do that. In this particular example here is the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab actually implemented a lot of this stuff on their live network. They put a lot of shims and proxies in using some of the code I talked about before. So they could talk to some of these things that don't even speak OpenC2 yet, but they sort of left the shims off the picture. And they made a bunch of these use cases of their real life, how their analytical teams spend their time. This particular example that I stole from them, I did because it had lots of OpenC2 commands on it, was a web drive-by. And it involved the command investigate, the command detonate, the command query, copy, restart, locate, delete. And even this is a very simplified chart because in the real playbook, there's decision trees and you do this if this happened and you do this in this order and all that kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is they did actually implement all this stuff and they have it up and working, and that is good. I think I'm still doing all right on time. So let's go back to talking economics a little bit. So, Phantom Cyber is an orchestrator manufacturer, so I'll caveat this with they're a vendor, okay? But in their marketing brochures, they have some use cases of actual real life customers that they've done automation work on automating their defensive stuff to get it to be responding in real time. And I'll have some numbers on what I mean by that on the APL example in a second. And they worked out that for this particular use case, they could save a company $1 million. Okay. And that particular case was just in the processing of their phishing emails. And you say, yeah, but they're a vendor, so vendors always put out stuff like this. So Zepco's not a vendor. Zepco's a user of all this gear. And at that same meeting, the same meeting as some of the other slides I mentioned back in March, I guess it was in May, they gave some of their use cases, and their conclusion was they have about a team of 10 analysts that do their sort of day-to-day stuff that they got to do as a managed security provider, so basically their SOC, and that they were getting on the order of a 25 to 30% productivity increase of the team they already have by implementing, and they included in that the fact they had to write the open source code that they then open source to make use of it. So they included even the development they needed to do to make use of it, and they were still ahead of the game. In other words, it was worth investing the time to automate this stuff because it saved their people so much time. And again, they were doing this some of the larger increases were in the area of phishing. But where the most impressive numbers came from was the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab that I mentioned before. This is one of their charts. It's very hard to read, so I'm going to cheat and highlight some of them, so I don't screw it up. I'm going to look at my copy. Because I can't read it either. It's too small. So the first thing is they saw a 5 order of magnitude increase in triage capability. So in other words, computers scale way better than humans do. Okay. They saw a 2 order of magnitude increase in the volume of indicator to mitigation incompleted. In other words, because the computer is scaled so well, they got way further down those priority lists than the humans ever got to. Humans, sat there, they got the alerts, they never got to the high priority stuff, they never got to the mediums, they never got to the lows. Because the computer scaled so well, it got to all of them and allowed their humans to be freed up to work on the things that the computers couldn't do, the parts that weren't automated yet. And the reason that's important is because we talk a lot in the industry about actionable alerts. It doesn't help to just generate all these indicators. You got to generate an actionable alert, which to date has meant actionable by a human. What can the human do about this? Okay. Well, when can you make those playbooks and make the computer able to do about it, you can scale that way better because now it's the computer doing the action. You can afford to do way more of them. And where the biggest gain, in my opinion, really comes from, and where I think the money for this will be in the long run, is they saw a 2 order of magnitude improvement in the time it took to deal with whatever it is that came in. So in other words, you're kicking the guy out 100 times faster than you were before. Okay. So if you think back to that Verizon chart that I showed, where those numbers were way off to the right-hand side, we're pulling those in to the left. And that's important for multiple reasons. It's not you're just being more efficient, okay? It's you're giving the bad guy less time to do something. He's causing less damage by your kicking him out sooner. So if you think of a normal attack vector, you're getting control of one device, you're doing lateral movement to another device, you're then exfiltrating the data out, and then you're doing something to try and give you your persistence. So there's like 4 or 5 steps in there. And if you look at most, real attackers, I'm doing real red team stuff or whatever, you'll find they don't use one vulnerability to do that. It's a bunch of steps, and you use different vulnerabilities at different points of that. If you can kick them out while they're still in the early stages of that, they're not getting to the things that are actually really damaging you. They're not getting to the machines. They're the ones that have your crown jewels on them, and they're not getting that data back out again. So that speed part of it, I think, is where this stuff really has the most gain, and you should really be looking hard at this. I'll leave some time for questions, so I'll jump over that. So I actually really think that if you everyone's going to have to use their own data, do it for their own companies and their own cases. But I think if you really use true mathematical modeling of your best guess. It's still going to be guesswork involved. There's still going to be humans making judgments. But the book has a lot of methods on how to do that objectively. So it's very similar to the NIST work, but just with a different set of numbers. Convert it all into dollars, make these charts, and compare the alternatives. I really think, if you think the blue is the base case of today, I really think of once you start putting these automation tools in, start making use of the OpenC2, start and get rid of the vendor lock-in. In almost all cases, my prediction is, it's going to drive people towards using this OpenC2 and using this automation. And in all these cases, it's going to pay for itself, and you'll have actually cheaper, better, faster security. So obviously, I'm a strong advocate of this stuff. So, obviously, very passionate about, I think OpenC2 is going to make a big difference. OASIS is the standards body where it's being worked. You're all welcome to join and help out with it. And depending on where you are in the industry, my sort of summary is, if you're involved in any way, and I have to give a talk in Wall Street next week, obviously I'm going to structure it a lot differently, but I think I'm still going to use the same end slide. If you're involved in instructing companies what to do, if you're a shareholder, you're a private investor, hold the corporate management responsible for all the cybersecurity stuff. That's the first. If you don't do that, nothing's going to happen. I can't help with that from a technology viewpoint. But if you do that, I think the C-suite will start using some of these, techniques. All said and done, the quant kind of analyzing cybersecurity is no different than how they do it already in a lot of their financial stuff. That's what that little white box is too small to read. It's supposed to be that chart that I made before. But basically, use the info from this book and do it. If you're security professionals, again, use this to make your decisions. I think your board will understand you better when you do it this way, and I'm positive the answers will always come out that OpenC2 is going to prove itself valuable in this. And obviously, in your vendor community, hey, see this stuff coming, you better implement this OpenC2 stuff. So I'm going to end with some of the words from Dan Geer, who some of you might know, who's a thought leader in cybersecurity, and I love the way he ends all his talks, which is, there's never enough time, so thank you all for yours. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions, and the first question gets a book. You get to pick whether you want the Alan Alda book on how to speak to engineers and scientists, or the cybersecurity risk book. Yes?
Older technologies and infrastructure, or is it something for, we say, moving Congress?
Yes and no. So I think initially, particularly, it'll be a bolt-on. Okay, I think it'll take a while for vendors to add to it, and even when they do, it's a new shiny, and I still already got all this stuff I already bought. Okay, I still have literally pieces of hardware. Okay, so I think in those cases, the use of these shims or translators or proxies or whatever you want to call them will still prove themselves in, because now your analyst team only needs to speak one language. So it doesn't matter the fact that I still got this, 5-year-old Palo Alto in there and I just bought this newest, Juniper thing. Doesn't matter, because I still design my playbook using the, deny command, not using the block or the stop command. I think over time, the use of the mathematical modeling of the risk this industry changes very quickly. I think people will make intelligent decisions on when it's worth changing out old stuff. I think if you do that modeling that I talked about, some of this, hey, we got to keep this mainframe around because we've had it forever and we don't know how to replace it. If you did the risks involved in some of that, it might be, no, it is actually, this could cause an extinction level event of the company if we don't solve this. Maybe we will pay for upgrading it or replacing it or whatever. But the important thing is you'll make the decision based on the data that makes sense to your company. Okay, and you'll make the decision. And in some cases it'll be keep it, and in some cases it'll be scrap it. In some cases it'll be, we'll put we can afford some bolt-ons on it because we do need to secure it, or we don't. In some cases management might say, no, we'll roll the dice, but it'll be an intelligent roll of the dice, not a, no, don't you, hey, you're just trying to use FUD on me and I don't fall for FUD because I'm smarter than that. It'll be, no, you're making a business decision and you decide. And sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it doesn't. It's your call. So the answer is, it depends. And with that, all right, so which book do you want? All right. All right, still got more books. Any more questions? Anybody want a book? Yes, back corner. It's too new to have any good war stories there. The companies I know that have implemented it successfully the best have all been reasonably small on a scale viewpoint. I worked for 35 years for AT&T. Can't talk too out of school, but yes, they're working in this area. They were on the, I showed their logo. They were one of the members. They're a big company. It's a super tanker. It doesn't turn that fast. So I don't have any good war stories from that. Probably the main thing there is it's just hard to move. It is different. So it is hard to move there. Even in the simple area of requiring your vendors to put it in. Bank of America is an extremely vocal. They say at almost every meeting, I want this in every procurement spec on everything we're ever going to buy. Once you get it good enough that I can do that, they have to caveat it, and so they aren't actually forcing the vendors to do it yet. So the vendors sort of know it's coming. So it's a little bit of a case there. If we get the Zepco guy up here and he was willing to give them, I'm sure he could probably give some good war stories. Another group that's very active in it, New Context was a company I had on there on the vendor slide, one that's involved in a lot of the California energy stuff. They're very hush-hush on everything they do. I'm sure if we could get them to tell some stories, because they've come in with changes. In fact, on the sticks and taxi stuff, they sort of put in the whole playbook and the whole, forget what they call it, but the way you combine everything and, if this, then that kind of stuff. And I'm sure they didn't do that just because they were, felt like doing it. I'm sure they have good cases, but unfortunately they're very secretive on sharing stuff. So fortunately, no, I don't got any good, but worry about this because that's going to bite you kind of stuff. It'd be the usual, hey, if you do it right, you're not going to do it, and everyone's going to have problems doing it because new stuff, you always do that. What is nice about it is because it is standard, or I will argue that because it is standardized, because it does play well with the sticks and taxi stuff, that you are going to find collectively we're going to all benefit from each other's mistakes. Yes, we're going to make mistakes, but hopefully we'll move forward better than we've been doing on this proprietary stuff. So which book do you want? Cybersecurity Risk or Alan Alda? Okay. Oh, definitely. In fact, from an analyst viewpoint, I would argue, I ran a SOC team at AT&T for a while in a previous life, and it's a rough job. Okay. It's a very, draining job, I guess I would say. And I didn't have to do it. I just had to manage people that were doing it. And so I realized that it's rough on them. And it's because there's always too much to do. And a lot of it's pretty rote and boring. The first time you get this kind of thing, it's exciting. The sort of 100th time you've done it, it's, I got to do this again. And the advantage of this stuff is, oops, oh well, I'll leave it on that one. The advantage of this stuff is they get this thing they're doing a bunch. They say, oh, I should make a playbook. Even if no one's done it yet, okay, I'm doing this again and again. I'm going to make a playbook for it. And a lot of our analysts at AT&T would just, whip up their own scripts and design their own things to do it. And of course, I'd do it my way and the guy next to me would do it his way. And so we'd all be doing it on our own and not shared. Now you're doing it in a common system that's shared, that once you do it across not only are you saving yourself time, you're saving everybody else time. You're incented to do it because it then frees up your time to get to the next interesting thing on the list. And so in the beginning, I'm sure it's a lot like, when you put a new IDS in and you got to train it. In the beginning, talking to the Zepco guy, there's a lot of churn because you got to sort of get bootstrapped up. But as you sort of knock off those most common ones, you're now getting to the more fun ones, the more interesting ones, the ones that the real reason why you have this job. So if I was a SOC analyst, I'd be arguing for this. So I don't have to keep, we switched vendors and now I got to learn a different way to tell it to put a stupid IP address in. In addition to that, my job will be more interesting because I'll be more on the design of the playbook and less on the hit the carriage return because they just got inside of the house. There'll still be some, no matter how, we're going to work our way further down the list. You're not going to get all the way down the list to begin with. So there's still going to be hey, we got to respond to a crisis. But they're going to be less, I'm always responding to a crisis, in my guess. I didn't get involved until after the name was picked.
My question is I hear you talking a lot about vendors, and they obviously have some reasons they would buy in, but how do you get open source software involved? As an open source project manager, there's really not much motivation for me to do this. Is there some sort of involved plan that you guys have, or are you just hoping that...
Well, like most open source projects, some of it's just you find passionate people. So like my open source code I wrote for it is because I'm passionate about it.
Like you got stored on a slide and you're putting data in, but it could take data out.
Yet, I agree. And some of it is, again, you got to get the right people involved in, hey, they want to do that. So you got to get the user community. So using Snort as an example, it's one that we do argue about some. You got to get the user community more involved in that now, hey, that's how it's being used in these playbooks. It's being used in a way that's good. What can we do to make it easier? And you just sort of evolve from there. So I don't know that I have an easy answer for that. It's no different than when we had a bunch of proprietary gear running the different things. Even the open source projects all have their own. So there's, at least 3 open source firewalls. And again, they have 3 totally different APIs. So this is just now a 4th. There's always that standard cartoon about, hey, there's 4 different ways to do things, so let's standardize. So now there's 5 different ways to do things. And that is true in this case. This is now the 5th way. But I think because it's going to make the SOC's job easier, because it's going to drive the economics of the particularly the playbook's going to drive the economics. That's going to drive hey, we can do some cost reduction here if we, all right. So an AT&T says, yeah, we got this stupid shim in the way. Let's just take the shim out and take our code and go stick it open source and Snort or whatever. I'm hopeful that the community will end up operating that way. I can't guarantee they will. It's like anything. It depends on how people respond. So I still have 2 books left. No one's wanted Alan and Aldous yet, but you still get a choice of 2. Okay. All right, I have 1 book left. Who's got a... Oh, well, ask a question then. Ask, what's this book about? Okay. So, I like accusing... Oh, he's got a question too, but I don't have another book. It's about how to speak to scientists and engineers, and it's by Alan Alda, the actor. He can be either a scientist nor an engineer. Acting, or yes, again, an argument we have some, mostly at the acting level. It's really designed for telling devices what to do, telling security actuators what to do, or orchestrators telling other orchestrators what to do. If in the process of doing decision making or sense making or sensing, it gets a little complicated. So what creates indicators? Okay, well, devices like firewalls. Well, I got to tell a firewall what to do even in telling it what to sense. So it's not designed to be an alerting mechanism. It's not designed to be the passing of indicators or the passing of threat intel, but it is designed to be, hey, I got to tell the thing what to do. So there's some little bit of gray area in those other 3, but it's again mostly in the tell what's the action I want to take? What do I want to do to change the configuration of my network to do with some security thing in as near real time as we can, in instantaneous. So instead of loading this firewall map of 10,000 rules, it's no, this just came in, go add this, open this port, close this port, whatever. Yes.
So one of the things you said is that OpenCQ will help address the problem of vendor lock.
Yep.
But it also seems like it requires the cooperation of vendors.
Right. Agree 100%.
And vendors make their money in many cases on vendor lock.
Right. Agree.
Isn't there a pretty strong business for them not to cooperate?
Yes. And that's why back when I was at AT&T trying to get stuff like this done, even though AT&T, I literally had a $65 million a year purchase budget. So people paid attention to me. Okay. But it was only $65 million a year out of the entire security budget. So they paid some attention to me, but they didn't say, hey, I want a standard interface so I can do all this stuff. They didn't do it. But if you had a AT&T, Department of Defense, Bank of America is basically representing the whole FSI SAC. They're basically a whole FSI SAC. whole financial community is going to stand around. You're beginning to get enough of a volume that says, hey, we're only going to buy it if it has this stuff. At least some of the vendors are going to do it. Okay. And some of the vendors are more visionary than others. There were some non-trivial vendor names on that chart I said. So there are competitors who are going to say, hey, maybe I better do it too. And then some of the cases, like, there was Palo Alto gear in some of those pictures, and Palo Alto has made some noises about maybe doing this, but that gear was running because somebody wrote a shim and just put the interfaces in, and we still did it anyway. And maybe they can afford to stay that way for a while. I don't know. But at some point, some purchaser is going to make the decision of, hey, that shim costs me performance or money or something or other versus this Juniper one that made a direct interface. Well, maybe I'll buy it. So I think the market will correct in time. I actually think it will drive it.
Standards for like communicating.
No, and I don't know if you remember, there was a chart where I had in there under acting, I said baby step, first step language. We have had a lot of arguments about when to start going to the next thing on that, and even what to do there, but we're still, we're not quite 100% there yet. The only other thing is sticks and taxi in the whole, in the threat intel, but that's really a whole different piece of the, people are thinking about it. We know we got to do them all to get there. And I got to get off because the other people are coming in for the next one. So thank you all.